Hi, I'm Austin, and welcome back to the Marshall Modification Project. This channel explores Marshall amp modification from an academic perspective.
And I'm Yang, and today we're joined by Dan Gower, who's going to take us through his journey as an amp modder. So please enjoy the interview.
Sure. Yeah. Well, first off, thanks ever so much for having me involved in this and inviting me along. It's really exciting to be part of this. Um, so really, like, I got into amp modification, I would say probably out of necessity. I was young, didn't really have much of an income at the time, and I was already fiddling around with my guitars, doing things like pickup changes, swaps, that kind of stuff. I was already a little bit tech-minded right off the bat. I think it came probably from my dad's side. He's similar. And yeah, basically, I I pretty much had a sound in my head I was looking for right off the bat. And the gear that I had at the time was quite basic and it didn't really do the job. I ended up inheriting a Marshall amplifier. It was a JCM800. It was a 50-watt amp, and it was in bad shape. It wasn't really working very well. Now, I didn't have anyone local to me who was a tech. I didn't know anyone at that time to take it to. So I started scouring, books, internet, anything I could find to kind of work out how to get this thing sounding, at least, to my ears, correct. And I sort of basically went down the rabbit hole at a very early age doing exactly that. I think I blew the thing up probably 10 times in a row, shocked myself, did everything you can think of to start out with. But then bit by bit, as I learned more about it and, figured this stuff out, I didn't have any formal training doing any of this. So it was very much at the beginning, like, try this, try that, try this. And you get quite a good understanding after a while of tinkering and trying things. So it was very much that was my starting point. That was the point where it all kicked off for me. And then I continued doing that for fun, but it wasn't until maybe a few years down the line that I ended up making a connection to a guy called Mike Fortin, who ended up then becoming a mentor to me. And he very much took me under his wing and taught me the ropes, really, about how to do this stuff on a professional level. And he really pushed me to sort of fly the nest, so to speak, and really to do this and take on, work from customers and to get out there and do it more and experiment and do new things. And yeah, I learned so much from him. That was a few years or so. And then ever since that point, for the next over a decade beyond that point, I've been doing it professionally. And, that's been my main thing ever since. So yeah, that's pretty much how I got into this. So
you touched on the connection with Mike Fortin. Are there any other key moments or just periods really that you think shaped your career, Dan?
I mean, I already started playing guitar when I was 6 years old, so I was a really early starter. And by the time I was actually starting to tinker with amps, I was already quite a good player. I was pretty much capable of playing anything I wanted to play at that point. And I think when you've worked hard on your playing, you reach a point where you then start to chase the tone more than the playing, because you've already developed a lot of your key skills. You know what you can do with the guitar, but you're very much held back if you don't have great sounding equipment. I think when you do reach that point and you realize, oh, I'm trying to get further, but I'm hitting a brick wall. It's the sound that I'm not getting, that's holding me back here. That was probably the turning point, really, that pushed me deep down this rabbit hole, I think. Yeah, that's pretty much how it went. I mean, obviously, I'm simplifying a lot of this, but yeah.
Cool. And would you think there's any maybe periods or points that that has shaped your approach? The Dan Gower approach to modding.
Yeah, I think early on, I mean, obviously, at the beginning, I took a lot of influence from Mike. Mike showed me a lot of things that had worked for him, but he always pushed me. He would always give me ideas to try, but he'd give me multiple ideas to try. It would never be the one thing. And there would be many times where I'd go back to him and say, oh man, I've been trying this and I just don't think it sounds good. And he's like, yeah, I gave you that info because I was hoping you would hear it doesn't sound good. You know, it's those little things that they're like little curveballs that I was that was thrown my way. And I think that's one of those things that definitely helps you to work out what you like and what you don't like. But generally, when I then got out of the, you know, of that time period, and I was doing it completely on my own without any additional help or support, from that point on, your own experiences, you're not, I don't want to say it's not about relying on someone else for help. It's more a case of like, you don't have anyone to bounce ideas off of anymore. So you have to start trusting your own ears a lot more. You have to really take the time to work out, okay, is this the thing I'm looking for? Yeah, okay, I've nailed it. I've got what I want there. Or you have to listen to it and really work out like, okay, is that really the best I think it can sound? You know, yeah, you could sign it off and give it away and someone would probably be happy with it, but am I happy with it? It's that extra 10% always that you're striving for. So yeah, I think when you're completely on your own doing that, you start to develop even more. I think that's really the point where you grow even more as a tech. You start to discover the certain things that you prefer. Everything from component types to construction methods to the way you lay something out. I mean, layout inside of an amp is very much like an art form. I can look at amps and often I can get an idea quickly who probably modified it or who worked on it just from the layout, you know, things like this. So you start to develop your own little things, your own unique characteristics of your work. And I think that was, as you were saying, what like shaped me, you know, shapes the work that I do now. Those stepping stones along the way very much all led to where I'm at now with the work I do.
Awesome. Cheers, Dan. I mean, sometimes there's a little bit of an overlap between the questions depending upon how you respond. But dialing into this kind of influence, but maybe it can be, you know, kind of a philosophical, what's the word, approach, or but maybe specifically about the technical aspects of the modification. Are there any specific modders, either current day, from the past, you think that have influenced or really your approach to modifying Marshalls? And you can get a bit technical if you like with this.
Yeah, absolutely. Right off the bat, the first one I'll say, hands down, Jose Arredondo. He's the one who really, in my opinion, he's the one who paved the way for most amp modders, because he was doing this stuff even in the 70s. You know, amp mods didn't really become so commercially popular until the 80s. But Jose was doing this stuff way back in the 70s. And, you know, some of the things he was doing back then, I mean, the kind of gain levels he was pulling out of amps in the 70s, you wouldn't hear in commercial amplifiers until the 90s, without a doubt. So, I mean, Jose Arredondo's work absolutely inspired me, mainly because it was from the guitarists who used his modifications. You know, they were guys who I grew up listening to, and I totally worshipped their playing and sound. So I think it was from a sound perspective before it was ever a technical point that I was influenced by him. So the sounds that his modifications created were a huge influence and still are to this day. I also was a big fan of obviously, you know, the Soldano stuff. Soldano's just, I mean, it's legendary. It's just a sound that we've all heard so many times. It's Lee Jackson's another one that I really enjoyed the work he did for many artists. Tommy Folkesson from Sweden, he's another big influence as far as the overall sound. I wasn't necessarily inspired by his technical work. You know, the actual circuitry that's different. It's very different, and I'm not really so much going into that direction. But the sounds he produced are absolutely, big inspiration to me. And also Todd Langner. Todd Langner is another modder who I absolutely love the work he did. It's all of these things have all influenced me in various different ways, and in designs that I currently do. There's elements of all these kind of things in there. So everything from, I mean, obviously, if we're talking about the technical aspect, obviously Jose Arredondo was known for doing the extra tube stage that was in front of the amp, almost like a built-in tube boost. And then there was obviously, diode clipping circuits. There were different types of master volumes, like a pre-tone stack master. And those things, I think, still to this day, 90% of amp modders out there are usually going in that direction first before they kind of find their own way. They'll usually go looking for something that's Jose related, probably because it's just the most popular type of modification out there. So I think that tends to be the main thing people go for first. But obviously, if you look at the Soldano thing is really a different way of the higher gain sound compared to Jose. Jose's was more like a plexi hot rodded with other things in there, whereas Soldano had more in common with the JCM800, where he had another gain stage in there, but he had the similar to the JCM800. He had the cold clipper stage, but it had the really exaggerated cold clipper that was like 4 times bigger value, and things like that, that create a trademark sound. And yeah, I mean, all of those ideas, I think you'll find in many modern day amp mods. Very similar ideas. They may be variations on a theme, but I don't think anyone's necessarily creating anything completely 100% new, but we're all doing our own kind of spin on a similar platform, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, absolutely, Dan. Getting into specifics, can you describe, I mean, the question is one specific mod, but it can be more than one if you want. A specific modification that springs to mind that you've made on a Marshall, and can you kind of tell us about kind of what you did, but its effect on the tone compared to the original amp?
Absolutely. I mean, I can describe the amp. One of the amps that's behind me right now. It's one of my circuits in there. And basically, this would have started out as I can't remember if this was a 2-input or a 4-input Marshall. Either way, when I work on these, I remove the front end almost 100%. So the whole preamp circuitry is removed, and then I turned the amp into a four gain stage all tube circuit, and the way it's designed is essentially that the front end is it's a very hot front end. It gets filtered through a relatively small cap, not dissimilar to say like how Jose would have done it. That's like a classic Jose thing, a very hot front end, and basically that trims the bass response so that then it doesn't get flubby before it reaches the next gain stage, at which point you can get a lot of gain moving into that next stage when it's been shaped. So there's quite a significant roll off in the bottom end frequencies. So this stops it from getting that bloated, flubby sound that you might hear, in some amps when you turn the gain up. Second gain stage is, a nice hot stage. It still boosts the treble. I say boost the treble. It doesn't really boost the treble. It cuts the low end. That's kind of what people talk about when they talk about treble boost. It's typically not really boosting the treble. It's just allowing the treble through at full force, but it's trimming the bass response again. Gradually, you go through into another gain stage, at which point the next stage is a little bit more flat response, because already you've trimmed frequencies in the low end already. And if you keep trimming them and trimming them and trimming them, you end up with quite a thin sound. So at some point you have to, you need to retain some frequencies and some thickness that you've already got there. And then I have a gain control for that stage, which is great, because the first two stages have their own gain controls, but they also have filters on the gain controls. So depending on where they're set, they'll filter out more of the bass or less of the bass. You can choose how much, so you can make it thicker or thinner with those. But this final gain control later in the circuit is literally just right before the last stage of the amp. And it's essentially just, it doesn't have a filter or anything. It just simply controls more or less gain going through and passing through to the very last stage, before the signal goes out to the tone stack. In this one, it doesn't use what they call a cathode follower circuit. This one uses a plate driven. So cathode followers you typically see in Marshall amps. It's got a little bit of a sound of its own, but essentially, you tend to see the plate driven tone stack more in a Fender or perhaps in a Mesa Boogie. They do it early on, but I'm doing it in the area where Marshall tone stacks would typically be after the preamp section. And at that point, you have that section of the circuit. If I install an effects loop, typically the loop, is then between the tone stack and the phase inverter of the amp, because then that way, essentially, you're not messing with the front end preamp section and the tone of it with the loop. It's more transparent that way. And then into the phase inverter, which typically is dialed in on a per amp basis. I typically boost the bass response in the phase inverter, bigger capacitors. I'll also change the HC voltages there, really. And the idea is just to make it a more broad, bigger sounding power section, because you can get away with doing that when you've got a more trim, tight sounding front end. You can have the back end of the amp broader sounding, bigger, and it doesn't go flubby, it doesn't go loose. So all in all, I mean, that's typically how I would approach that, the circuit that's in that one, the Killer Cali. And as with anything, every single amp, is always tweaked on a one-to-one basis, because you can have 10 old JMDs or JCM800s and you can modify them 100% the same and they won't come out sounding the same. So you've always got to be tweaking it. It's a little bit like the chef in the kitchen where he's tasting the soup and he needs a little bit more salt, a bit more pepper. It's simply to taste. You just have to trust your own ears as a tech, and you have to dial the last small adjustments in here and there, purely by ear. And with a guitar in hand, you've got to be testing this stuff every step of the way, because you can't just trust your ears. What can sound good doesn't always feel good. So the end result with this is that, compared to the stock amp, if this was done to, say, a 2-input JCM800, in comparison to that, it's much, much higher gain, significantly. I mean, there's probably 70% to 100% more gain overall. It's completely usable. You can crank those gains right up. It doesn't oscillate. It doesn't flub out or anything in the lows. And you can pretty much use it for anything from vintage Marshall tones to, let's say, 80s rock or 90s rock, or even beyond into really like more modern, heavy death metal or tech metal, anything you could think of. And you can do it all just plugged straight in. You don't need pedals, because it's got the response built in. So if you think, obviously the older amps, you're usually having to boost the front end. You're usually having to use an EQ or a clean boost or some form of an overdrive to chop the low frequencies. And with this, the whole purpose of it is so you can just plug straight in, job done. So you get more dynamics and the things you want. So you can do more with your fingers, your hands, the guitar's pickups.
Awesome, Dan. Thanks for the detail on that. Just a couple of follow-up questions, actually. You kind of touched on it. So, you've obviously done quite a lot to change this amp. How do I phrase the question? So would you say it's still got this Marshall sonic identity? And if so, how is that Marshall sonic identity preserved? What do you think is preserving that sort of character of the Marshall?
I think one big factor is the phase inverter circuit in the Marshall and the feedback design, the power section. I think that's the foundation of all of this, because obviously, that's a great sounding circuit. And the front end being, significantly different, the way I've voiced the front end, it's voiced still very much with the Marshall tonal characteristics in mind. It was always the idea to retain that sort of Marshally mid-range. I mean, there's certain values of gain stages and things that you see in Marshall circuits that tend to be known as the Marshall values. Like typically cathode resistors are usually 2.7K, and there's usually a parallel capacitor that's a 0.68 microfarad. So you typically see that as like that combined with a 100K plate resistor and either a 22 nanofarad or a 2.2 nanofarad cap as the coupling cap. That's your stereotypical Marshall gain stage. And there's essentially a couple of those in there. The way they're done is very slightly different, but obviously certain values do have a certain tonal response. The frequencies they allow to pass through, the frequencies they trim, very much gives you that sound you're looking for. So if you're trying to retain that Marshall vibe, it may be that you want to keep, say, maybe like the second gain stage of a Plexi. You may want to have that in the circuit because it has a certain sound. The same way if you do mods on Fender amps and things like that, if you go too far away from traditional values in certain key places, you're going to shift the voicing. So really the key to building a circuit that's different, but it has a familiar vibe, you need to find ways of keeping certain things traditional while building the circuit in other areas. So yeah, there are certain things. I mean, also the tone stack of a traditional Marshall, where you've got the 33K slope resistor, the 500 puff or 470 puff treble cap, 22 nanofarad for the bass and mid caps there, and you've got your classic 250K, 25K and 1 meg EQ, 3-band EQ there. That certainly has a sound to it. It's definitely got a frequency response that has that Marshall broad mid range. There's very much like there's a big broad peak there in the mid range. I mean, when you start to change that around, that's when you also hear quite a shift away from the Marshall sound, because like this one behind me has got a mid shift switch that I added where it's a 3-position, and it's 3 different tone stacks. And you've got your classic super lead style tone stack. You've got one that's a little bit more like a super bass type tone stack, and then you've got a tone stack that's really, it isn't quite exactly like anything. It's perhaps a little bit more in the Soldano direction, but it isn't actually the same value Soldano use. It's really somewhere in the middle of the other two. And I mean, the super bass tone stack is very much almost like Fender values, really. You've got a much smaller treble cap there. You've got a larger slope resistor, and you tend to get more of it's not necessarily really a scoop, but it just isn't a broad mid hump anymore, which really, if you switch between that and even a more controlled slight mid hump, the very slight one will still sound scooped. It's just your ears are going to hear it in a scooped fashion, you know. So as soon as you switch to, you know, a setting like that, it does shift a bit further away from the standard classic old school Marshall vibe, and it definitely gets a bit more of the sort of the US voicing, or like more of a modern voicing, you could say. So you tend to find a lot of guys who play really heavy stuff tend to favour that slightly more scooped sounding tone stack. They don't necessarily scoop their mids. They run a lot of mids and everything, but it's just that because it doesn't have the sort of the mid honk. I think a lot of those guys favour it more. I know that I did several amps years ago for the guitarist Josh Middleton from Sylosis, and he had a mid shift in his amps, you know, that was essentially like the more honky sort of push mid thing. And I think the default setting that he liked more was the slightly more scooped voicing. And then he said when he was recording to make leads really pop out and jump out the mix, then it was the more mid honky, you know, classic Marshall voicing that he would engage. But I think generally when he was out on the road playing it, it was mostly he was using the more scooped voicing. So, you know, but a lot of those things, they really do change the whole characteristic of the sound.
Brilliant answer, Dan. Thanks very much for that. That's exactly what I was after. Just before I hand over to Jan, are there any kind of, again, modders that you draw influence from, or any trends? Is there any of the modders, specific modders from the past, present, future, not future, from the past or present, or any trends influence kind of what you're doing when you're working on a Marshall?
For me personally, I've got to be honest. Like my influences are not so much the current guys, but more the old school guys. But I'm always watching around. Like I don't spend too much time, you know, staring at others' work, because the only thing I think you can sometimes do is you start to second guess yourself. If you're staring at everyone else's work too much, you start to think, oh, hang on, you know, that seems to be popular at the moment. Oh, should I do that or should I do this? And I don't think that's a great thing, because I think there's room for all of us in this. I don't think everyone needs to be copying each other and doing the exact same thing. You know, if someone is doing their thing, it's really pointless for me to step on their toes and do the exact same thing. You know, like a prime example of that is like, you know, myself and Dave Friedman, we're both influenced by a lot of similar people, but the exact ways we do these things and approach them, we actually don't see eye to eye 100% on every single thing. Like Dave's got certain things that he prefers, and he'll say to me, oh, you know, I'm not as keen on that. And I'll be like, oh, well, that's weird. For me, it worked. But we've come to the conclusion that, you know, it's great to have your own thing and your own taste, and stay with that. But it's always good to be inspired by others, in the sense that when you see there's lots of other people coming along doing new things or doing their take on things, sometimes you see, you know, others doing it and having fun in it. Sometimes even, let's say, if you're having a rough day or something, sometimes seeing something like that, it just kind of, you see it and it's like inspiring. All of a sudden you just think, oh man, they're like, now I want to just go and fire up the soldering iron and just try a million ideas in an amp, you know. So I would say, like, I'm probably not massively inspired by like other guys' work out there at the moment, as much as I am inspired when I see them putting out stuff that's interesting and cool. It makes me want to go away and dig deep. So that's really how I get my inspiration from it. I think for me, the biggest inspiration, though, with amps is always for me to listen to music. Whenever I'm listening to some of my favorite albums or artists, you name it, like, you'll hear certain guitar sounds, and in the back of my mind, I'm sitting there thinking, man, I wonder what they were using on that. And there's not always documented info on a lot of those, or, you know, classic albums. You don't always know exactly what was used. And sometimes I'll just be like, you know what, I really want to go and just pull apart a Marshall and see if I can modify it to like get that sound. and I'll sit there and I'll draw out a schematic completely from, you know, my own imagination, and start playing around with ideas. So yeah, that for me is the big influence, I think, you know, listening to things that I love the sound of, and then it's like, oh, that's the sound I'm striving for, or that's something I want to be able to get similar to, or, you know. So that for me is that's what really does it for me anyway.
Brilliant. I mean, it wasn't a question, but I'll ask you now. It's in your head. Go and give us some names of inspirational guitar tones that you've tried to either recreate or deconstruct.
Well, I mean, let's face it. I mean, the first one you're probably going to hear from anyone is Eddie Van Halen. So, I mean, the first few Van Halen albums, I think it's the one that people are still to this day, they're trying so hard to chase and trying to mimic, and you can't get it. You know, it's a unicorn. You know, it's one of those things. But it's fun to chase it and to see how close you can get. Big inspiration for me was always John Sykes from Whitesnake and Thin Lizzy. And I mean, as soon as I heard Whitesnake '87 record for the first time, just the opening slide, you know, on The Still of the Night, that was it for me. I mean, as soon as I heard that was mind blown. George Lynch. George Lynch was another one who I absolutely, you know, totally grew up, you know, loving his tones and playing. And more recently, I'm now doing some amps for George. So I've done the one that he's now using as his main rig. So, you know, that's been really cool. Who else? Doug Aldrich. Doug Aldrich from also who's in Whitesnake and Dio. I mean, he had some of the best Monty Marshall sounds ever. Still does. And you know, that's always been a tone that I've always liked to chase. And you know, it's not necessarily always just the Monty Marshall guys either. It's, you know, I mean, I absolutely love the sound Nuno Bettencourt got on the Porno Graffiti album. I mean, that to me is like one of the greatest guitar sounds. It's just it's unique. It's really aggressive. It's in your face. There's lots of others. The Norwegian band TNT, the guitar player in the band, Ronnie Latecro, absolutely love the sounds that he got. Still, for me, that's one of the top 10. Who else? I'm sure there's someone missing. Akira Takasaki from Loudness. Absolutely mind-blowing guitar tone. Probably some of the best of the whole 80s guitar players. I always found the most interesting sounds, the ones that had something a little bit unique. You know, it's maybe there was a certain mid-range that they had, or, you know, Michael Schenker's another one. I mean, he really had such an inspiration on that whole mid-range boost that everyone used in the 80s. So, you know, bands like Striper, they had that monstrous high gain thing that sounded like a wah-wah pedal was parked in the middle. And I loved all those sounds, and I still love them to this day. So, you know, I'm sure there's probably a bunch that I'm not remembering right now that I'll kick myself later for not saying, but those are sort of like some of the main ones really for me.
Yeah. I'm smiling because you listed probably, you know, it's very similar to what I would have said as well. I grew up with two older brothers in the 80s who just, it was quite funny. On one side of the corridor, there was one brother playing kind of commercial rock, you know, hair metal stuff, and then the other brother playing thrash. So we got all the tones. Excellent. Cheers, Dan, for that. We'll hand you over to Jan, who's going to ask you now a few questions.
Hi, Dan. So earlier you touched on typical Marshall circuits. So I'm just wondering, like, how does the circuit design of Marshall amps enable or complicate your modifications compared to other amps that you've worked on?
Sure. Good question. So really, the first things first, I mean, like the Plexi circuit or the JCM800 circuit is like typically the most common donor amp that I do mods and rebuilds to. First off, like there's a few reasons for that, just because of the fact that it's already got the right kind of power section, the right kind of filtering, the right transformers. You know, the mains transformer puts out the kind of HC voltages that I want to see. The output transformer sounds good in those. It just generally, you know, 9 out of 10 of them sound good to my ears. The build, the layout inside, I mean, it's it's really conducive to modification. It's just easy to work on because you've got a relatively small circuit board in there, but it's not got an awful lot on it. So it's not like it's crammed together. Like if you crack open like a Mesa Boogie or a Marshall DSL or something like that, you just see rows and rows and rows of resistors all in line with random circuit traces everywhere. Whereas the JCM800s and Plexi circuit boards, if they're PCB, if they're the PCB ones like the 800s and late JMPs, they're more or less just a PCB version of the turret board versions they made in the 60s. It's all exactly the same. The plate resistors, the caps, the cathode parts, they're all in the same locations as the original point-to-point ones. And they're very easy to work on. It's easy to reuse the circuit board traces without problems. Everything's spaced apart nicely. There's flying leads from both sides of the board, which is great because then that way you've got more ability to reconfigure preamp tube sockets. In my case, like sometimes if I'm not using a traditional cathode follower stage, then if that's already printed on a circuit board and it's already been laid out with the traces with a PCB mounted socket, the only way really to reconfigure that is to actually get a Dremel out and remove some traces, which you can do. I've done it on many amps and it's fine. But it's just more of a hassle really. So when you've got an amp that's got flying leads either side of the circuit board, there's a lot of room to change things. And there's also a lot of space inside the chassis as well. So if I work on a JCM800, if you look at the front panel, at the point where the two vertical inputs are, where you plug in, the guitar, everything to the side of that is empty space. I mean, it's like a whole block, like, that big inside of nothing in there. So, I mean, in many cases, I'm adding 3 or 4 extra preamp tubes in these circuits, or I'm adding a whole Fender circuit inside as a clean channel, like foot switchable cleans or tube buffered effects loops, gain stages. And just to have all that space there is great because I can fit, another 3 preamp tubes down there. It works great for that purpose. And the other great thing about them is they're robust. If you work on a JCM800, the great thing about it is, you could throw it down a flight of stairs and it's not going to die. It's they're just built like tanks. And I've had one sent to me before randomly when I bought it on eBay, I think, or something, and it wasn't even sent in packaging. It was just they put a black bin liner around the amp with a hole for the handle. And the courier delivered it, like a normal, I think it was Parcel Force or someone, they delivered it. And it didn't have a problem, didn't have an issue, no broken tubes, no nothing. So, JCM800s are really strong amps. JMPs are also really tough. I just think they're a great choice if you want to have an amp modded or rebuilt and you want it to be robust so that it can, survive on the road or wherever you're going to use it. So, yeah, in a nutshell, that's pretty much why I tend to use those. And they don't really present me any problems, when it comes to modding them. They're just very, very convenient and easy to work on for my taste.
Yeah, thanks for the detailed answer. So, can you elaborate on like some features like the Marshalls they have that makes the modding easier or harder? Like, for instance, how do these features compare to other amps that influence the type of mods that you do?
This thing. So, are you asking? Sorry, can you repeat the question for me?
Oh yeah. Sorry, that's my bad. So
No.
can you please elaborate on some specific features of Marshall's circuit design that make the modding easier or harder?
Sure.
And for instance, how do these features compare to other amps or influence the types of mods that you do?
I mean,
Sure.
sorry, just to butt in, you've kind of touched on it a little bit already,
Yeah,
Dan,
yeah,
tell
yeah,
us
a little
about it.
bit,
But
but
if
it's
there's
just
anything else you want to elaborate on, go for it.
Yeah,
Compared to
absolutely.
other amps and stuff. So.
Yeah, so I mean, if you compared to like the mods that when I do mods to Marshalls versus other amps, because I've modified tons of other brands. Everything from Mesa Boogie, Soldano, Bogner, Friedman, who else? Yeah, Laney. There's countless names. I'm not even remembering half of them. But they're all different. They've all got their own things happening. But depending on the original circuit that's in those other amps, it's not always convenient to completely go removing their original circuit because of construction methods. So, for example, like if they've already got a PCB board that's very specifically laid out, and you decide, oh, well, I want to turn that into a 2-gain stage plexi circuit, but the amp originally was 5 gain stages with an effects loop and all this other stuff. It's really not gonna work very well at that point. You would just be better off working on a different amp. But in those situations, normally what I'll do is I'll talk to the customer and say to them, like, what actually is it you're looking to achieve? Because rather than asking me for a specific circuit, it's better if you ask me for a specific sound, and I will try to then redesign that existing circuit to get closer to that sound. Because there's many ways that you can attack, the job of nailing a particular sound, and there are multiple ways to get there that will sound pretty close. It doesn't, you don't necessarily have to do, that circuit exactly. You might be able to get there in a slightly different way. So if it's an amp that's already relatively complex inside, and a lot of the features and their design is very much baked into their construction and their boards and everything, then I'd rather just try and work with that, perhaps to revoice what's there, rather than to kind of turn it into a completely new circuit. I just don't think there's a point in doing that with the wrong choice of donor amp. But when it comes to modifying the Marshalls and Marshall style amps, I mean, because there's many amps that also really are like Marshall copies inside, like the 80s era Laney amps, the Pro Tube lead and AOR amps. I mean, inside they're more or less just a JCM800 with a couple of extra functions in there, a few switches, or maybe an extra tube. So in those situations, the layout they already use inside, for the controls is quite convenient, in Marshalls, because, for example, your gain pots are not far away from the board. You don't have to have big, long, shielded wire runs everywhere. Generally things like that. I mean, that's that kind of stuff, it's just convenient to work on. But it's, as I say, I'll work on other brands and different things. It's just, you just have to have a different approach when you work on this stuff. So, the way you do your Marshall mods will probably just be different to how you do, your mods to other things.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Yeah, thanks for that. So earlier you touched on the sound in your head and tone chasing. So I'm just wondering, in your experience, how have the guitarists' demands for specific tones or their performance needs shaped your approach to modifying Marshall amps?
Well, I would say one of the main things that's a big factor in the tonal requirements of modern day players is definitely that most guys want to have something that is clearer, tighter, more responsive. The big complaint with a lot of older amps or classic designs is that, it sounds really good, but it needs a boost in front. Or I need to use it with this exact pickup or this exact pedal. Otherwise, it doesn't really get the sound that I want. So most of the time when I'm doing these high gain circuits for a lot of, current day players, usually they want to know that the amp can get all the gain they want, more or less just plugged straight in. So they can just get that tight response. So I'd say tighter tones, like the tighter bottom end, is a big factor. Definitely that's a big thing, because if you go back to the 90s and the 80s, the bottom end in the guitar tones was a lot softer. it wasn't based around that. They really were basing their tones all around the mid-range. It was mid-range and top end to really cut through. Mixes were not so dense with bass back in the day either, whereas nowadays there's a big bass trend. You know, people want depth controls, resonance controls on their amps. That's another modern common thing that I think we can, you know, definitely cover. You know, resonance circuits, you know, in power sections to basically deepen and widen the sound of the power section. That's a really common thing. And I find that most players that I've done work for, when I talk to them about how they use that, they typically use a lot more of it than say I would personally. Like I might run like a depth control at 9 or 10 o'clock just to add a little bit of subtle width. But I don't really want it to add much in the way of like big thumpy bass. But many players, they're running that thing at 3 o'clock or maximum. They just want that massive, just huge bottom end response, because then you can dig in and the front end is tight, so you get that really percussive bottom end response. But the power section is big and wide, almost like the sound you get on like a rectifier when it's in the modern mode. You get that big, wide, fat thing going on. So combination of tight, clear front end combined with a much thicker sounding power section, that definitely seems to be the more preferable thing for a lot of players these days, especially in the heavier music category. You know, for the more you know, thrashy or you know, general metal players, they usually want that kind of sound. And they're usually actually really surprised when they plug into one of mine for the first time, because they're not used to it being able to do that just plug into the amp. They're used to having to run all this other gear to shave the lows and do all this other stuff. And they plug into one of these and I'm like, right, check this out. Like, I'll pull a switch and they'll just be like, whoa, there's the sound. It's there. You know, it's great. So yeah, that's definitely, I would say, one of the more common trends in what modern day players are looking for and searching for. Probably also low noise is another big factor. Many old amps, they hum. Well, many modern amps, they hum, shamefully, but they shouldn't. But, you know, because of using AC filaments in amps, for all of the tubes, they're running on AC supply. So you get the line noise coming through, you know, and it hums. It doesn't matter whether you've got your volume on your control wide open or closed off. You're still hearing that low hum. And a common thing now is you know, replacing those filaments with you know, the filament supply with regulated DC. And you know, that's something that I've been doing since the beginning of my career, and I do it now, and I do it on pretty much every amp, because it's great when you're playing. You stop playing, you don't hear any hum. I mean, yeah, there's a little bit of hiss, but you know, hiss is not a problem, but hum is a problem. And yeah, it eliminates the hum. So I'd say the low noise factor is a big thing. Maybe one other thing I could mention while we're at it is probably the effects loop, because years ago, a lot of guys didn't use effects loops. They used the front end, but their amps weren't very gainy. You could use the front end and it wasn't so bad sounding. But if you take a high gain amp and you put delays and modulation in front of the amp, it just sounds terrible. So one of the more, you know, common requests, you know, nearly every amp I work on, is that they want a really good, clean, transparent effects loop. So it's got to be able to, you know, handle pedals or racks, drive long cables that are on long stadium or, you know, festival stages without loss. And it's very important that it doesn't mess with the sound when they go engaging a pedal or something that's sat in the loop. So this is something that, like, amps from the 90s typically had terrible loops. Even into the 2000s, early to mid 2000s was still pretty bad for effects loops. Maybe around like 07, 08, then loops, generally you saw loops like getting better. So that's another feature that I think is really important nowadays more than ever. So
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thanks. So I think you've touched on what I was about to ask. So I'm just wondering, like, when the tone that you created, so getting back to the guitar playing, so what specific guitar playing techniques have you observed guitarists using or developing due to the tones produced by your modifier Marshall amps?
Interesting. So let's think. I mean, really, the tone that you use is to some extent gonna influence the way you play. Because if you listen to guys who play with a really non-compressed, not very gainy sound, let's take someone like Angus Young, AC/DC. I mean, he's got like plexis and JT45s and stuff like that cranked up, but he's not really using an awful lot of gain at all. It's really just power amp distortion that you're hearing with a pretty clean front end. So the way he plays, you'll notice that he doesn't really tend to play with much legato. I mean, yeah, okay, he does the hammer-on thing on Thunderstruck, but that's about it. Most of the time, he's normally picking most of the notes. And there's quite a few players who I see that have a similar approach. They're very much alternate pickers. And I think it's got a lot to do with the gain response that they like in an amp. They can't necessarily get away with playing fluid legato because the amp doesn't support that. If you want a fluid legato style, if you play very much, in that sort of kind of slippery legato style that you hear a lot with fusion guys, you'll notice a lot of them use amps that are very warm, very round, very saturated sounding. They're using like Mesa Boogies with the gain turned right up and the treble right back off. And it gives you that very, very comfortable compressed feeling so that when you're playing legato style, you can do it and it doesn't really give you any issues. But you try doing that with a plexi, it's game over. I mean, you just can't do it. So, guys like Angus, guys like Joe Bonamassa, he also doesn't use much gain. He uses lots of power amp distortion from, the power section breaking up on lower gain amps, and, the speakers are pushing hard, but it's not much in the way of preamp gain. So those kind of players, you can definitely hear there that they shape their sound, they shape their playing style around their tone. At least I think so. I know that any time that, like, I typically, personally, I play with quite a blend of legato and staccato picking. I like both and I use both a lot. I don't lean more one side than the other with that. And even still, like, I find that, like, if I ever guest at a gig somewhere and I jump up and, like, I'm plugged into an amp that's got hardly any gain and it's not turned up very loud, so it's not really distorted in the power section, it's hard to play. And immediately I'm not picking up the guitar and doing like legato licks and stuff. I'm picking every note. Like I'm sort of picking, I'm fighting to stay afloat, really, when you're picking every other note and playing with the staccato style. So yeah, that very much influences, the it influences the playing and everything like that. So for me, I always wanted like my designs to fit both styles. I wanted it to be a comfortable balance. I don't really like an amp that feels dry. Something like this is hard to explain, like to non-guitarists, but some amps, they give a very dry response where it feels like no matter what you do, it's not giving you much in return. And then you play other amps that are so ridiculously easy to play through because you feel like you could just close your eyes and play anything and it will come out sounding good through it. Um, my my goal was always to be somewhere in the middle there, leaning slightly more in the direction of slightly more comfortable playing, feel with an amp. So that if you're a staccato kind of guy, it will respond and it won't be out of control. But if you're a legato player and you like to do a lot of that kind of stuff, then, it will be just as comfortable for you as well. So yeah, that stuff definitely is important when you're voicing a circuit or when you're designing a product, designing an amp.
That's a great answer. Thanks, Dan. So I'm just wondering, like, from your own experience, like for the guitar players that you worked with, like earlier you mentioned Josh Middleton. So have you observed any like techniques that you'd say would link to like particular modifications or tonal qualities that you've worked on? So like specific stuff.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I could actually, on the subject of when I did the amps for Josh, it was a real curveball for me when I first worked on an amp for him, because I assumed, because he was more of like a thrashy metal guy, that pretty much the design brief was going to be tight, ultra fast, really snappy response. You know, like some of the other guitar players that are into those kind of sounds, like Ola England is really into that more sort of really, you know, percussive kind of bottom end. And I distinctly remember when Josh brought his first amp to me, and we sat down and we had like a cut room and spoke about what I was going to do for him. And I said, like, you know, what kind of tonal characteristics do you typically favor with amps? And he was like, well, I don't like the modern metal thing. And I was like, oh, okay, interesting. You know, so he's like, yeah, like the kind of sound you hear a lot of the gent guys using, and like Ola and the other guys who have the really percussive thing. He's like, no, I don't like that. He said, I want one that's got a little bit more give to it, and a little bit more of a round kind of sound. But this is the tricky thing. It had to be kind of a warmer, kind of rounder sound without being loose and flubby, which is really, really hard to do, because the more you kind of allow those frequencies to stay in the circuit, the more there's a risk of it being a squishy, flubby mess when you pick on the low strings, you know. And so that took a bit of work really to dial that into his tastes and to work out what it is that he liked or disliked. You know, luckily, you know, I got to work on a few amps with him. You know, I did a few of them over the next few years after, and we were able to refine that a bit more. And he would come over and play it and, you know, make some suggestions, and then I would change things up, and then, you know, he would try it and see how he went with it. And yeah, it's just interesting how sometimes the thing that you probably by default assume in your head that someone's going to want, it's not always the case. It's really interesting how sometimes those jobs can really throw you a curveball. And I mean, for him, like, he's like, Josh is a real super tight picker. He's one of the best technical guitarists I've ever met. I mean, he could play anything. I had one guitar here that had like sky-high action and rusty strings on it, and he picked it up and made it sound like, you know, it had low action and like the best sound ever. So he's just got the great sound in his hands. But he's got such a clean picking response that his playing style is so clean that if he was playing through a super ultra tight rig, I think it would sound clinical and sterile. So for him, he needed like something that had a little bit more, you know, body and a little bit more warmth to it, so that, you know, when he's picking fast and playing, you know, real percussive stuff, it doesn't sound like too like clanky and metallic sounding. It still sounds nice and musical. So, you know, that's definitely sort of, you know, on that point that you mentioned.
Thanks for that. So before handing it back to Austin, I'm just wondering if there are any other like instances like Josh, like that you'd be willing to share, like stories with other guitarists with
Sure,
their
yeah.
tonal demands.
Yeah, I mean, I did. I've done probably more than half a dozen amps for Andy Sneap, you know, big time, you know, metal producer and guitarist in Judas Priest. And the two I did for him are the main live rig that he uses for, you know, touring the world with Priest. And when I did those, that job actually came off the back of a recommendation from Nolly, who used to be with Periphery, and Adam Nolly Getgood. I'd already been doing some amps for Adam, and he got one back that I did for him and loved it. And immediately he sent a sound clip to Andy Sneap, and straight away, I think within 2 days, I got a phone call. He's like, I need to have one of those done. Like, when can you do it? Like, straight away. Like, so I did it for him, and this is a prime example of how sometimes, you know, just going by sound clips, you can get a good idea of something being close to what you want, but you may find after you've had it done that you might want a few little things different. So, for example, like when he got his back from me after I'd modded it, this is Sneap, he said to me that it got a little bit more low end response, you know, in the preamp section, a little bit more there was a little bit more bass in the game response than he wanted. And he was like, is there any way we can just trim maybe, a little bit of like the sort of, the range of 100 to 250 hertz out of the gain voicing and make it a little bit clearer and a little bit tighter. And so straight away, I got him to send it back and I started working on that one. And I came up with a solution that's basically a control that when it's set on maximum, it's the original voicing that his one had when I first modded it, which has got a decent amount of, give in the bottom end. It's not, razor sharp and super tight. But then as you turn it back, it gets tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter until it's really ultra, like crazy tight on the minimal setting. So it's really like a gain response, aka like a tightness switch control that I did for him. And as soon as he got that back from me, I mean, he said all he needed to do was dial it back to like 3 o'clock. So like 5 o'clock being like maximum, like he only needed just a tiny little bit less, and that was where he wanted it. And he said it just lives there on that position. But the point is, it just goes to show, like, great players have got a really clear idea of what they want, and they know exactly what they need usually. So obviously he played it, and in 10 minutes he knew that he just needed a little bit less of that frequency. Soon as I did that for him, it's like, yep, perfect. And I've never had to work on it ever since. It's done every tour since 2021, I think. So yeah, it's great. So that's an example of another thing that I've done. Trying to think of anything else. It's probably a handful of things that I can't remember off the top of my head, but yeah. But it's always fun working with players. Put it this way: it doesn't matter if it's famous players or guys who just play for fun. It really doesn't make a difference, in my opinion. It's lovely to work with the big pros, but at the same time, it's just as rewarding to work for the guys who don't play for a living and just really enjoy playing guitar and playing through amps and stuff, because everyone's looking for a certain sound or looking for something. And when you're able to work with someone one-to-one and really get it dialed in, when the end result is that they are like over the moon, it's crazy happy with it, that's the best reward you can ask for. So
All right, thank you. I'll hand it back to Austin.
cool, man.
Awesome. Cheers, Jan. Yeah, thanks again, Dan. Those were brilliant answers.
Yeah, no problem.
We got the next two questions are kind of around the kind of modern culture, I guess, and kind of sense of community. So I mean, the first one is more around the the culture, the community, and so on. How would you say your interactions with other technicians, guitarists, such as sharing techniques, shaped your sense of that there is a community around this thing? Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that. And you can go back as far as you want, right to when you started or up to now. Sure. Tell us all about it.
Back when I started out, it was very, very hush-hush. Very much so. This was a really secretive industry. If anyone was doing anything that they were making money from, they were covering up their work. And, the circuits were either epoxied, in proper potting boxes, filled, or they were gooped, like silicone gooped to cover things up. I mean, guys were doing that all through the 80s. I mean, like Dumble always did that with his circuits. Like, he used to put a big thick layer of silicone over it so that you couldn't see anything underneath. And, so it's always been a little bit of a secretive industry. Mind you, I think it's probably not really dissimilar to how it is in like other parts of the gear industry. Pickup makers, they're all quite, keeping it under wraps about exactly how they make their stuff. And so yeah, there's always been that element to it. Particularly years ago, more so than now. I think there's a lot of stuff that's already got out there now, and people are a little bit less precious about gatekeeping it. before it was definitely one of those things where, you know, if you landed on some info and you didn't know too many people who got it, you were sort of, you know, keeping it well hidden. And I totally also understand that, you know, people who make amps and make, you know, people who make their own circuits, yeah, you don't necessarily want to go laying it out on a plate to everyone to do for themselves. But at the same time, you know full well that anyone can buy one of your amps or your mods and they can look inside and they can, you know, they can probably, you know, with a bit of work, figure out what's going on. So you can do everything under the sun to hide this stuff. But, you know, my thoughts are nowadays that it's just better spending your energy on doing the next design or the next idea that you're working on rather than trying to, you know, keep the old one hidden. So it's sort of like that. But as far as the community goes, I mean, it's in more recent years, I would think that there's become more of a community because the DIY crowd became a bigger thing. You know, like people who were building the Metro amps, you know, in the last sort of 20 years, like the Metro amp forum was a big DIY source, you know, for all information and ideas. And, you know, anyone could just open that up, make an account and start grabbing ideas of anything they saw and try it. I mean, that's not dissimilar to, you know, really what I did earlier on. You know, I learned a lot from there. There was a lot of respected builders on there, you know, who were sharing info, and it was great that they were. So like nowadays, I mean, like Mike Fortin is still a really good friend to me. You know, we don't work on stuff anymore really together, but we've always had a great trust there. You know, we can talk openly about this stuff, you know, all day long. It's great. And you know, he's really cool to talk to about ideas and other stuff. I really get on great with Dave Friedman. Dave's great, and not only that, but Dave's also actually sent vast majority of his UK Friedman amp owners to me whenever they want the Friedman factory updates or upgrades, the mods, all the other things. They all come to me for it. So that's been a really great sort of, you know, like a working relationship really. And, you know, it's a great guy, really easy to chat with and, you know, chat with all, you know, about this kind of topic. So it's great. And also Jason from Headfirst and also Shay from Monomyth Amplification. Those two guys I only really connected with at the beginning of this year because we started doing a monthly podcast on the Headfirst channel. So we do like, it's like a 3-hour long podcast that we do every sort of 4 or 5 weeks. And yeah, those guys are great. Like I get on really well with both of them as well. So, you know, the 4 of us on the Amp Chat, you know, me, Friedman, Jason and Shay, we talk about all this stuff and it's great. It's really nice. It feels like there's a good community. And if there's anything, you know, I can do to help those guys out or that those guys can do to help me out, it's nice. It's nice to have that support there, you know. It's also just nice sometimes to just talk about this stuff with people who also do it for a living, you know, because they get it. They've been there. They've seen things that you've also seen that maybe, you know, some of the amateur ones won't have seen yet, and you can't quite, you know, relate to. So, you know, it's really cool to have that kind of community and friendships. So it's not something that I had before. I was very much on my own. For probably the best part of nearly a decade, you know. I mean, yeah, back around 2015 or 16, I think is when me and Friedman connected, you know, through emails and stuff like that. And, you know, that's when I started doing some work for him. But other than him, yeah, it was mostly just with Mike Fortin in the past. So it's nice to just have a, you know, a bunch of guys who all share that love for building amps, modding amps, you know, all things technical related, and you can just, you know, yeah, it's great.
Just so when we spoke to Dave, you know, obviously being based in LA, you know, he was kind of in the thick of it, and he was, you know, getting mentored by people, and you know, his previous job working in the the rental company established all these links and so on. I'm just interested, what was it like for you in England? I mean, you touched on it, that maybe you were a little bit, I don't know, isolated. I'm not trying to put words into your mouth.
Yeah.
So what was there actually any on the ground, scene in England with modifications, or was most of it online for you?
Most of it was foreign work. For me, I mean, like when I first started out, it was vast majority of it was a couple of Brits and mostly Europeans. And it was pretty much like that, it started out with doing more work for the Europeans. Probably the first couple of years, there was a few Americans. But the thing is, though, when I started out doing it, me and Mike Fortin, we worked on a design together that we called the Cali mod. And it was like a sort of a modern day take on a Jose style thing, but with our own preferences and changes throughout. It was quite different, but still had sort of like that style of sound to it. But it was great for doing more modern heavy stuff too. And when we first sort of put that out there, we kind of agreed like, okay, well, Mike, you'll do Mike said, like he would take the American and Canadian customers, and he said he would just let all the, have all the European and UK guys come to me. So most of the work that was coming into me was coming in, it was being shipped in from elsewhere, mostly from Europe. This was obviously back pre-Brexit, you could send stuff across the border and it wasn't getting taxed, and it was great. It was a great situation. But then I think it was around 2012, like Mike was then working for Randall. So he got the gig as the head designer for Randall, so he was no longer doing any mods. And he's like, you know what, just have all the customers. He said worldwide, he said, just take over for me. And I did. And then all of a sudden it was just inrush of Americans. Tons and tons of Americans. I mean, probably for the next 3-4 years, it was mostly Americans that I was doing work for. Some UK customers, but it was mostly Americans, then Europeans, then Brits. So there was generally less British customers. Whereas in more recent years, like in the last sort of like 5 to 8 years or so, I'd say there's been more British customers now than I don't mean compared to others. I mean, there's been more Brits coming to me now versus what there used to be. I've still got all the Americans, and I've got, Europeans, customers in Japan, Australia, you name it, everywhere basically. But the number of Brits has increased, who are purchasing mods from me, which is nice. But I think the whole modded Marshall thing was bigger away from the UK. Like when I first got into this, at least for the first 5-6 years or so, I think it was bigger in America. I think it was bigger in Europe, but it wasn't yet as big here. And I think, I don't even really know why. I mean, maybe it's just because of the trends in music styles. There was a lot of there was a lot of bands around at the time, when I started out, who were playing like old vintage amps with fuzz pedals in front and stuff like this for that really alternative thing. So that was really popular for a good 4 or 5 years. And then that kind of died out. And now people are using like Marshalls again. People are using like amps that have got a good bit of gain on tap. And I think that whole kind of 80s rock thing also revived. It came back to life again, and people started really liking that kind of genre again and celebrating it. So as soon as people were playing that kind of music, obviously they need the right gear for it, and it's you've got to have a modded Marshall if you're going to do the 80s rock thing. So yeah, I don't think like back when I started there was much of a scene, but now I mean people are coming to me way more in the UK. So I think it's sort of built up. Generally, though, I think Americans and Europeans are into it more.
And what about actual techs? So were there any, techs in England or around the general UK or anywhere that you kind of worked with in the early days when you were kind of learning this, or was it an online experience for you?
No, it was just the only tech I had any communication with was Mike, who was in Canada. So we had like Skype and all that stuff, video chats and all that kind of thing. And we used to be like on the phone messaging daily, like we're like best mates and everything. So we were just like chatting about amps and circuits, and we'd be sharing, gut shots of amps that we, found, and rare things and all sorts of stuff that you couldn't find anywhere else, unique stuff. So it was really just me and him back then. Like I wasn't connected to any other techs. I didn't really know any around these parts either. I mean, yeah, I guess there are, but I don't know many techs who actually do mods, because it's one thing to be a repair tech. It's a completely different thing to be a guy who does mods and who does, amplifier design in terms of like, trying to obtain a tonal result. There's loads of guys who can, repair an amp if it's blown up, or they know how to, replace parts and do all that kind of stuff. But you wouldn't know where to start when it comes to actually voicing a circuit and designing a circuit. So yeah, I didn't really know any others in the UK, and I'm not even really too sure now. Most of all the people I'm in touch with are either Europeans or Americans, or like Jason in Australia. So I don't know. I've sort of always felt that I'm sort of kind of maybe there are others that are doing it here that I'm just not as familiar with. I've not been personally connected with them before, but yeah, it's always seemed that anytime that people talk about amp mods in the UK, usually they end up throwing my name in the ring. So
brilliant. And rightly so, Dan. I mean, getting on to that now. So we just generally talked about the kind of culture around modding in this community and the scene and so on. Thinking specifically about your position within that culture and that scene and that community, how do you think kind of your knowledge and experience of all of these modifications, that it can be like your understanding of the historic modifications and your in-depth knowledge of all the techniques, how do you think that's contributed to your reputation?
I think it's a big part of it. I think that with this stuff, obviously knowledge is power, but it's not just it's not only the knowledge, but it's the understanding and having the ear. I think having the ear and having the hands, that combination is the thing that allows you to serve your customers much better. So, for example, if you take someone like Jose Arredondo, he couldn't play guitar. So he would modify amps for people, but as far as I know, like what Dave told me, he said he would just have a guitar strung up and he'd just like plonk the strings, just to see if it made sound, and turn the dials and see if it worked, and he'd be like, okay, it's done. So I can't imagine working that way. It's impossible. It would be like working completely blind doing this, because you've really got to be able to play decently well. Don't get me wrong, you haven't got to be like the world's greatest player, but you've got to be able to play good enough that you can feel right from wrong, as far as I'm concerned. Like, if a certain amp needs to feel a certain way and you can't play very good, you're going to struggle to have any idea of, does that play easy or does it play hard, or what is it like? Is the feel right? Is the sound right? If you can play well, it makes everything much easier, because you just pick up the guitar, and as soon as you start playing, as an experienced player, you'll know if that feels right or wrong. If you can instinctively trust your hands and your ears, everything from the sound to the feel will just be there. And I can tell sometimes, there's many cases where I'll mod, an amp, and the end result, I'll plug it in, I'm like, okay, it's cool, but it needs like that extra 10% somewhere. Like there's something that's not quite right. And I'll figure out what it is, make the adjustment, and then I'll plug in and play. And the first note, I'm like, okay, yeah, that's exactly what it needed. Bingo. But then other times you plug into something and it's just perfect right from the get-go. The first note you play through it, you don't have to make any further adjustments. And it's just there. But I can't imagine how you could ever do this job if you can't do that. You need to be able to do that. So I think probably because I was a guitarist first, before I was an amp modder, I think was a huge advantage. Because if you go the other way round, if you've got all the knowledge and all the textbook skills, but you can't play a note on the guitar, then you're in a terrible situation, because you've got that knowledge, but you can't use any of the knowledge. You need the ears and the hands. So for me, really, that's the big thing that I think that gave me the advantage right off the bat. But then combining that with learning, like, I mean, I'm the kind of person who gets straight up obsessed with things. Like, I can't switch off at night if I'm doing stuff. Like, I'm obsessed with learning. And if there's a particular amp or a design or a particular sound or whatever, I'm so far down the rabbit hole. Sometimes I won't come out for months. Like, my head's just in that zone. So I think that very obsessive kind of mentality with tone chasing and everything, combined with being able to play as well and having a good ear, I think that's the thing that makes me as a tech. That's really, I think, the sum of it.
Cool. I mean, just to pick up on it a little bit, obviously nowadays you're doing the kind of podcast thing, and when you do those, it's really clear that you know what you're talking about. It's clear that you've got all the experience and knowledge. Maybe even starting off, were you posting on forums or in Facebook groups or any of those kind of? And do you think maybe that helped you grow in your reputation as this guy knows what he's talking about? Did any of that come across your expertise and that knowledge that you were gathering from your hyper focus? Do you think that benefited you, and that sort of was something that people picked up on?
Yeah, I think so. Like, early on, like, I used to be active on, like, some of the forums, like the Rig Talk forum and Harmony not Harmony Central, Huge Raxing. The other ones, there was a lot of different techs and builders that were on those places. And yeah, I used to post some of my work on there, and you'd end up with a little bit of a fan base that sort of follow your work, and they always enjoy your clips and things like that. And then I didn't stay on there very long. Like, I think I probably stopped using that around 2012, 2013. And I sort of got more into social media and using, Facebook and Instagram and stuff like that. And to be honest, I'm not as active on Instagram and Facebook as I really should be. But, I post up my work on there every now and then. If I've got something in particular, I'm just like, I feel like snapping a picture of and sharing it. I put it up on there. Or I've done lots of video clips where I'm playing through my creations in the room, and they're not all doctored up either. Like, normally I'll put the iPhone in the corner of the room, because I like the idea of people being able to hear what it's like being in the room, rather than having it all studio mic'd and all the rest of it. Because then most people aren't going to be using studio equipment and all that stuff. So, they want to hear just how it sounds in the room. So I'm like, okay, iPhone in the corner, get playing. And, I've done tons of clips over the years like that. And a lot of that stuff has really boosted my profile. Particularly the videos and things like that. Like, they get lots of likes, lots of comments, and then sometimes, famous guitar players see them and then they contact you for mods and stuff like that, because that's the great thing about social media. There's everything from amateur guitar players to celebrity guitar players all over it. And, they're all watching these things. So, it's great. But yeah, I mean, probably over the last 10 years or so, I would think social media has probably been the place where people have probably, gathered an opinion about my work. And because the thing is with that, obviously, it's not just about what I post, it's what other people post. That tends to be more valuable. If certain people post up that they're amp-bodied and they really love it, then, I mean, that's the best thing, because people believe that, whereas if I stand there and say, oh yeah, this is the best thing out there, well, they're like, yeah, of course you're going to say that because it's your work. But if someone else says that about your work, it's great. It's an honest review. So a lot of really positive reviews have done wonders for my reputation and for drumming up business. because I never advertise anywhere. I've never, since day one, ever advertised. It's always been word of mouth or word of internet, I guess, you know.
Brilliant, Dan. Thanks. Just the last little follow-up on that before I hand over to Jan for the last two questions. You mentioned very briefly, gatekeeping. Did you get a sense of that? Maybe beyond people trying to hide the circuits, was there any kind of gatekeeping that you were familiar that sort of appeared, particularly maybe during your early days as you were trying to get it established?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it was mainly with the guys who were making a living from doing this kind of stuff. You'd see, various old things. Like I said, like the Dumble amps were full of it. And I mean, he even used to have a card on the inside that said, if you share photos of this or publicly or anything, and he finds out, he voids your warranty. Like he would even like actually ask you inside the amp, like he'd have a written message asking you, please to refrain from sharing, any of the knowledge inside that amp with anyone. I had a bunch of Cameron modded Marshalls, Mark Cameron modded ones that I've either worked on or owned, and I mean they were filled with epoxy. Not epoxy, silicone, like this thick, and I'm sure probably Dave said similar as well, because I know for a fact that he's worked on a few of them. And those things were completely covered up inside, and you'd get I had to repair one of them so to get through it all. And underneath then you find all the resistors, and the caps have had all the parts scraped off of them as well. So it's like, yeah, it was real secretive business for a long time for people, and even in the beginning, I covered up a lot of things as well, because I was one of the few guys doing this. I didn't know anyone else who was doing really what I was doing. I would, put like a little dab of silicone around, some, clipping diodes or things, things like that, stuff that nowadays it's pointless covering up because people know about that stuff. But back then, nobody did know about it. But, it's like I say, like I'd already said before, it's like, you can cover up stuff, but if someone really wants to get in there and find out what's going on, they've only got to buy one and pull it apart. It's if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. So it's really pointless stressing out about that stuff and worrying like, oh, someone's going to find out my secrets. If you're great at what you do, your whole career is not based around one small secret that's in an amp. It really isn't. It's also not based around one design that you've done. Let's face it, I mean, there's a million Soldano clones around the world. Did Mike Soldano lose business? In my opinion, no. I don't think he did. People who wanted a Soldano, they went to him. They went for the real deal because it's going to sound like the real deal. If you get a clone of it, you don't know what it's going to sound like because you're paying for his ears. Him and his team who make them, they sign off every amp. You're paying for their ears and their, everything. It's a whole experience. So yeah, I don't really worry too much about what people know about inside my amps these days. It is what it is. It's not going to change the fact that someone who comes to me for this, they're not going to go to someone else for it. They come to you for a full experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And just one last follow-up. You mentioned that, this kind of stuff's more in the public domain now than maybe it was in the past. Why do you think that is? How did that process occur?
I think maybe it's just because there's probably been increased interest in these types of amplifiers now. I don't think it's got anything so much to do with people wanting to save money and do it themselves or anything, because the fact that I've never been out of business in the last 15 years, and neither is Dave Friedman or is anyone else who does mods, we're all still thriving. I don't think it's got anything to do with people wanting to, save a few pennies. I think it's just that people are interested. They like the idea of tinkering with equipment. And I think it's a great thing for guitar players to tinker with this stuff a bit, but even if you're not, like, don't get me wrong, I mean, I wouldn't advise that if you have no experience or knowledge, you really shouldn't go diving into an amp, because you might find yourself, up against the wall, after you've been shocked and fried. But, it's important to know that there's dangers with these things. But generally, like when it comes to tinkering with your guitars, You know, that's how it started out for me, tinkering with guitars and then messing around with pedals, then your amps. And, you know, you got to start somewhere. But I think it helps you to discover more about what it is you love about tone and equipment. The more you mess around with this stuff and the more you experiment, the more you will learn, oh, okay, that doesn't work for me. This really works for me. But then it's the question of, well, why does that work for me? So that's why you then going down the rabbit hole. You're digging deeper to try and find out, you know, more of all this stuff. You know, it's just a big discovery process. If you look at like the way Eddie Van Halen did, he started out by, you know, pulling apart his guitars and trying different pickups or different tremolos and things. It's like that. And I think anyone who experiments with their equipment, you know, they develop a more of an understanding about themselves as a player. I think it's all a holistic thing. It's not just, you know, tech versus player. You can marry those two things together very much. You know, that's how it's always been for me. You know, and for me, it's 10 times more interesting than just being a player. Also being interested in the technical side of it, because there's a whole nother thing, you know, when you think like, you know, sometimes you work really hard on playing, but you reach a point where you feel there's a little bit of a plateau for a while. Well, when that happens, rather than burning out and playing, then you can dig deep into the tonal aspect of everything. This is like a new thing to keep you inspired, keep you interested. Meanwhile, makes you want to play more. It goes hand in hand. It's like a big cycle. So yeah.
Cool. Excellent. All part of the Tone Quest. Awesome.
Absolutely. It never ends.
Fortunately or unfortunately, who knows? Dan, sorry, Jan, yeah, you've got the last two questions here for Dan, so I'll hand you over to Jan.
All right, cool. So when it comes to the influence of the Marshall mods, so how have the historical Marshall mods influenced other amp designs that you're familiar with?
Well, I mean, if you look at some more common ones that I know of right off the bat, famously the Soldano SLO. That was obviously, you know, in the mid, I think it was just around the mid 80s when that came out. And I mean, then Peavey came out with the 5150, which was very much a straight rip off of it. It's not identical, but it's, you know, there's a massive amount of it that is a straight, clean rip off. And then also Mesa Boogie, the famous one is the rectifier. The dual rectifier, I mean, the preamp section is like 99.9% the same as the SLO. Now, they don't sound the same. If you put an SLO in the room and you put a Mesa Boogie in the room, you know, a dual rectifier, you can play them side by side and they don't sound the same. There are similarities, but they use a different power section, different filtering, different everything. So, you know, it's very easy. You know, you put those two schematics side by side and there's no mistake in it. They're one definitely copied the other, and it certainly wasn't Soldano that copied anyone. So yeah, there's been a lot of those, and pretty much any amp out there that kind of based itself on the rectifier, in reality was basing itself on the SLO. So I mean, it's even like, you know, the whole thing with the Soldano had the 39K cold clipper stage, which is like hilariously large for a cathode resistor. You know, most people would rarely put above 10K there, but there's a 39K cathode resistor there because he meant to put a 3.9K in there and he accidentally put a 39K in there. Ended up making the amp liking the way it sounded, and it stayed. So, you know, that same mistake, we'll say, you know, it's not really a mistake, but it, you know, it was in his design. That's been copied, you know, in the Mesa Boogie, in the PV, you name it. So loads of people have taken inspiration from those. Let's think. The Jose Arredondo thing, you know, with the extra, you know, basically the bright channel of a Plexi, that gain stage put in front of a Plexi, you know, and add in a master volume. That's really all it is. It's just a duplicate stage. It's just another bright channel stage in front of the amp with a master volume, you know. And he did other things, like sometimes he did a special one that had like a push-pull switch with a different, pre-tone stack master and stuff. But generally, that kind of thing has been used as the basis of various designs, so that's a common one that's out there. And I'm trying to think some others.
Can I ask a kind of question that's related? And
Yeah.
we've asked this one, I think, to everybody, and it's related to this.
Yeah.
Let's say we start off with the Plexi, and then we work our way up to modern day. Could you trace that lineage, that DNA? How does that all evolve over time? What would you say on that one, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, it basically comes down to, it started out with only a couple of gain stages. I mean, if you think about it, like very early Plexis, you've got like JTM45s. They were really the sort of like a super bass, really, that kind of circuit. 2 gain stages, very fat sounding. There's not really much in the way trimming off the bass response. So it's really a bluesy, slightly sort of fuzzy around the edges kind of sound. And that was really just Marshall's, more or less a clone of the Fender, the old Fender Bassman and everything, but using British parts. So then gradually over time, when they went up to the super lead and super bass circuits, super bass was more or less very similar to like the JTM 45 thing, but they changed the rectification. They stopped using a valve rectifier and they started using a solid state rectifier, and it's a little bit quicker response. It's a little bit more dynamic, I think, for that reason, slightly less compressed. And when they offered the super bass or the super lead, now the super lead was then the attempt at making that super bass circuit more tight, more bright, a little bit more distorted, a bit more edgy sounding. So that was like the first step, in the direction of taking things a bit more and a bit more and a bit more. And I think then, you get to like the early 70s super leads, and they're the gainiest of all the super leads. They've got the most aggressive sound and the most sort of upper mid gain of all of them. And then from like 76 or 77, then they started doing like a cascaded, a bit more like a cascaded front end, like basically like it was sort of like the normal channel and the bright channel cascading together a little bit, with a master volume, but it wasn't yet the JCM800 circuit that we know. It's really rare, you don't find them very often, and there's a few wacky values in there. I forget actually if that's even cascaded the first one, but I know when they got to the 2203 design, which is what we now think of as the JCM800, that's when we then got an extra gain stage. So we got 3 gain stages. That's when I think that's when they up the ante, and then it's sort of like everyone then wanted a bit more gain and a bit more gain and a bit more gain. So there was a point where, obviously then in the 80s, people started having extra tubes added to the amp, either in the front end somewhere or, somewhere else in the circuit, just so that you would basically get more gain. It would already feel like it had been like a pedal in front of an old Marshall, but plugged straight in. You got all that, and then you could still run your pedal and go crazy with it. So if you look at it around that point, that big turning point would have been in the late 70s to the early 80s. And then I think probably during the very early 80s, that's when then the big mod guys like, Lee Jackson, Jose, because obviously when Eddie Van Halen started publicly saying that Jose worked on his stuff, he took off in by the next day, he was already famous. Lee Jackson, Harry Colby, I think Rivera was still modding stuff at that point as well for a lot of the 80s musicians. So, and really at that point, that's kind of when the whole game changed and it suddenly really took off. I think that's when everyone was then kind of fighting for their place on the throne as an amp builder or as a tech. And from that point on, then it was more or less, variations upon a theme. And then in the 90s, then obviously Mesa Boogie became very, very popular because the rectifier just, hit big at the right time. and it didn't have the previous association with the 80s because it was a 90s design, and it didn't look like an 80s amp. So when the grunge thing hit him, very popular, big seller, and it survived all through the 2000s and to this day. So yeah, it kind of, I guess really it all took off around the early 80s. That was the big time when things all started moving forward. And then ever since then, sort of each decade, you can see some changes in there. Like around 2000s, I think is when you really started to see more channel switching stuff, like more extensive stuff where they had MIDI functionality, and built-in functions like built-in noise gates and things like this, and, you name it. So
Dan, we just kind of head on some. Sorry, just to recap. I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I'm trying to recap. So we went from the original Marshall kind of circuits, the super leads, JCM800s. Then modding started to happen to add those extra gain stages. Yeah. That kind of took off with the Jose Arredondo and stuff. Then we kind of hit as the next step, would you say that's the Soldano? Would you think, is that probably maybe the next step, or is there something that we're missing?
Yeah, I mean, probably, yeah. The Soldano was like in the mid-80s, so it was really like the first production amp that did that sound. Mm-hmm. It was a sound of its own. It wasn't the same sound as like you get from a Jose or a Lee Jackson. It was more of a thicker sound. It was definitely a bigger sound overall. And that was sort of the big thing that kicked in and was crazy popular throughout the end of the 80s. And even through to the early 90s, a lot of people were still, Soldano crazy at that point. So there was a big trend there. And that's obviously why then the other companies like PV and like Mesa Boogie all jumped on the wagon and tried to do their own version of that same amp. And I think throughout then the 90s, really, that's when, Mesa Boogie kind of took over, because Marshall didn't really make anything particularly useful in the 90s. They made the JCM900s, but I never thought the 900 was exactly, an upgrade from anything they'd done. It was kind of a downgrade. So, really the thing that led the way throughout the 90s was probably the Mesa Boogies, the PVs, all that kind of stuff. And then that was probably the most popular kind of rig, the old boosted 5150 or boosted rectifier through to around about 2004, 2005. Like, that was the thing that everyone was chasing, that sound on all the metal records. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So,
and sorry, go on, Dan. So you were going to finish.
No, sorry. That's all I had to say there on that. So, yeah.
Again, just trying not to lead you. Do you think the Soldano was influenced by the previous sort of development of amplifiers? Do you think? We're hopefully we're going to speak to Mike, but what do you think? What's your take on that? Do you think it was drawn influence from it?
Yeah, I think it was influenced by the whole sort of high gain mods that were happening before it. But I don't think his circuit was actually all that influenced, because his circuit is more, to me, it's more like a modified JCM800. It retains more of the JCM800 sort of style, if that makes sense. Now, don't get me wrong, it isn't a JCM800, but it has more in common with one versus, like, say, a Plexi modded. So whereas like Jose's thing was more like the hot rodded Plexi, really bright, very way more percussive sounding. It was a tighter sounding amp, brighter. Whereas to me, the Soldano, you plug it in, and when you think of the time frame that it was made in, it's so modern sounding for something that was made in 85 or 86. I mean, it's staggering to think that came out then and had that sound, because really nothing else sounded that way. Maybe if someone modified your JCM800 back in the 80s, but I don't know anyone who was modifying them like that. So really, I think his thing was a little bit more unique than perhaps some of the other things that were more just add a bit more Marshall to a Marshall. His kind of thing was a little bit different, the way he approached it.
That's really interesting. I was always under the impression that, the kind of mods, the Jose mods and so on, would have been also doing things to the 800, but you're saying that was kind of almost primarily a Plexi sort of mod. Is that what you're saying?
Well, basically, the way Jose would do is if he worked on a JCM800, he would essentially be converting the front end more or less back to Plexi spec.
Okay, right.
Then doing his mod to it, so it was converted into a Plexi. So he'd add like the extra holes on the front panel for the extra input jacks and stuff like that. So you can Jose mod an 800, but it's not going to have the 800 DNA in there anymore. It's going to have the Plexi style DNA. So like this, it's a super lead type thing. I mean, don't get me wrong, he probably did. I mean, I'm not the authority on Jose's, and Dave's seen probably 100 of them, over the years, because he's so close to that area where all of that was all happening at the time, and he knew Jose. But Dave can probably confirm if Jose ever actually did like a different mod to like JCM800s. But as far as I know, the ones that I've seen that were originally 800s that were then modified by Jose, he converted them to the Super League spec. Right. And then moved the master volume, and did the sort of the unique volume control thing that he used to do to his circuits. So
interesting.
So yeah, it was sort of like converting the 800 into a Super League first, then modding it.
Fascinating. And so you're saying that the Soldano would be more aligned to a modded JCM800, if we wanted to say that. Right.
Yeah, totally. Because the thing is, like, there's a couple of things in there. Like, for example, like there's a cold clipper stage is in the JCM800. It's the second gain stage, and it's a big cathode resistor, like a 10K, and it's not bypassed with a cap, so it's not allowing certain frequencies to pass through specifically like a normal stage would, and it creates a very sort of asymmetrical clipping. It's a very unique sound. You lose some gain in the process because the stage is biased really cold. It's like almost like one half of it is in cutoff, but the one stage is clipped really harshly while the other is not as much, and it really gives a certain sound. And Soldano has a really extreme version of that, where it's not like a 10K cathode, it's like nearly a 40K cathode. So it's like it's a really, really over the top means of doing a similar thing. But I wonder if that was inspired by the 800, because obviously the 800 started in 1981. So looking at it, I mean, I don't know that many other amps that had like a cold clipper stage in them. So yeah, maybe he was inspired by that. Who knows? Maybe he wasn't. Maybe it was a happy accident. It might have been, because, like, for example, I have heard that big value resistor was supposed to be like a 3.9K and not a 39K. So maybe he wasn't inspired by it, and he landed on it as a happy accident. Who knows?
Excellent. Well, hopefully we'll find out. Awesome. Cheers, Dan. That was really interesting.
Thing, isn't it? It's a cool thing. You never quite know for sure until you see the one who invented it. So
yeah, brilliant. I'll hand you over to Jan for the last question.
Cool.
Oh, actually, can I just add one follow-up?
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so when we talked about like the Soldano amps being this like breakthrough points that then which came PV and Mesa Boogie, but have you seen like any sort of breakthrough points like that in more recent years, say after 2000, or like that, like something new came up that changed the game?
Well, I mean, there's a handful of amps that have come along that are doing things perhaps that you couldn't get in other production amps at the time, that you would have to have got through getting mods done, like Friedman stuff, for example, like his BE series amps, like BE100. This is sort of like Dave's take on a Jose style thing. I'm sure he won't mind me saying that, because he's publicly said that many times. It's sort of like his take on that, but with some things that he does his way that he likes the sound of more. Which is cool, because you can buy one of those and it gets you sort of like in that ballpark, rather than having to get a Marshall modded, to like a Jose spec or something. It's got its own thing. What else is there? I mean, the Fortin stuff is really cool. For example, like, the Fortin did an amp that was called the Natas. And this is like a really cool thing that's got like a front end bass and treble voicing, so you can actually tailor the gain of like the first stage of the amp, or the first couple of gain stages, where you can like sweep the frequencies and get the perfect kind of sound. That's a really cool thing that that's pretty unique. I mean, many other amps that are out there are loosely based around old designs. You know, I mean, like one amp that was quite popular for a while, the Marshall JBM. I mean, that's more or less like based around a sort of a hot rodded JCM800. Again, like not dissimilar to the topology of, say, like Soldano type thing, but just very different values throughout. So it's like more lean, and it's not as thick as a Soldano. But the point is, you know, if you look at it, it's 4 gain stages. There's a cold clipper, you know, on one of the stages, you know, that sort of thing. It's not miles away. So there are a lot of amps out there that have that kind of thing. They're variations upon a theme. But as far as real breakthrough amps that are like really unique, I'm probably not the best person to ask, because I probably don't know about, you know, certain new ones that have come out, because I probably just haven't seen them or haven't heard of them. That's the only thing. You know, I'm kind of a little bit old school in the things that I'm constantly, you know, looking at and, you know, watching and trying to find. So yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
But
that's
I
great.
think essentially, like a vast majority of amps that are out there, we're all sort of doing our own variations and our own take on things that have probably been done before. It's all just application of electronics, and, you know, essentially, you know, if you make enough changes to something, it's no longer like identical to the thing it was before. It's something a little bit different. It's something a little bit unique. It just comes down to how unique. I mean, you know, there's not that many things out there like currently that are like, whoa, okay, this is so different that nobody's ever done it before. It's like there's probably something that's been done before that's not miles away, but perhaps this one has been done as like an improved version, or it's got these things that the old one didn't do. So there's a lot of that happens, I think, in the amp world.
All right, that's great.
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks for sharing. So, for the last question, so how do you see the future of amp modding and the amp modding community evolving with the rise of digital modeling technologies like amp sims or like Camper, that sort of stuff?
So, like, I think there's room for it all. I know that there's been a lot of people have said, like, oh, I don't think tube amps are going to survive, and they're not going to be in use in, you know, 10, 20 years time. And, you know, it'll all be digital, it'll all be AI, it'll all be everything else. And I don't necessarily believe that, because I think that, number one, musicians tend to be, well, a lot of musicians tend to be purists. There's a reason why people still play the Gibson Les Paul. And it's been around for like, what, the last 70 odd years, right? And it's got masses of design flaws in it that make it go out of tune. The headstock breaks off, but people still pay 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 for one, right? Insane money for one. People are paying, you know, tens of thousands for brand new guitars from the custom shop. So the point is, people like what they like. And I think that guitar players will always have a soft spot for the real deal. You know, yeah, it's absolutely great to have a digital emulation of something, because it could be the difference between you getting to plug in and play at night in an apartment versus not being able to play till next week when you go to the rehearsal room. And it's great to have solutions. And I always think the digital thing, I absolutely consider it to be a solution to a problem. The problem being that there's a lot of guys who simply don't have the budget to travel with heavy equipment. Then in that case, I'm absolutely, you know, behind it, you know, and I think that the digital thing is a great choice. And I think that the sounds that you can get from them are great. You know, it's totally good. It doesn't sound the same as the real deal. It doesn't feel like the real deal, but the sound you'll get from it will totally do the job if you need it to, you know, it's good enough. But when you've got the choice to play the real amp or the digital thing. And I've got both. I've got many digital products. I'm not a snob when it comes to this stuff. Like I've got a Kemper, I've got various modelers, plugins, all the neural DSP stuff, and I've got then all like a massive collection of amps. And even if it's late at night, I'll still plug in one of my real amps for me personally, and I'll still play it, even if I've got the volume right down low, just because I like the feel and I like the response and I like the tone. It's just a more enjoyable experience for me. And but if you're in a situation where you just can't do that, then great, digital's perfect for that, and I'm totally in agreement that that's a great solution for someone who needs it. So I think that going down the line, I think that the digital stuff will improve. I don't think it will ever actually achieve the same thing that the real amp does, because by nature it simply can't. The technology, the way it works is different. Even if you emulate it, it's still I don't think it's going to feel the same, and it's not also going to give you the same feeling as sitting there and looking at one of those things while you're playing it and feeling good. So I think there's going to be a market always for both. And there'll probably be, more amps in the future that try and combine the two. They'll probably try and combine, like they've done it before. Marshall did it, and a few others did it. Blackstar did it. They tried to combine some like digital stuff with tubes, valves, whatever people call them, and hybrid things. There'll probably be some more hybrids. I know Friedman does that with his IR pedal, the IRX. They've got like a hybrid tube and digital thing, and it's great. So, if that industry continues to improve and get better and better, I think it's only a great thing for guitarists and musicians. And I think as amp guys, we all just need to keep up in our game. We need to keep doing better and better work and striving to, make things sound better and better. And I think that's how it will go forward. As long as obviously production of parts doesn't stop, but I can't see that being an issue. Let's face it, there's a million things that have stopped being produced in the past and amps are still being built. I don't think there'll ever be any issues there. So, but yeah, I definitely think there's room for all of it. There's room for digital, there's room for analog, all great stuff as far as I'm concerned. Just none of it is a replacement for the other. It's just, it's a solution.
Right. Thanks for the detailed answer.
Yeah, no problem.
Dan, would you say that have you found any, what's the word, an increased awareness of modifications, maybe because of any software products or Kemper profiles or any of this stuff? You think any of that's been responsible maybe for increasing awareness of the modern community?
Yeah, it could be. It could definitely be, because there's a lot of Kemper profiles of things like, Lee Jackson modded Marshalls and other types of modded Marshalls on there and stuff. So, and I know that there's the like Neural DSP have got the Fortin, the nameless thing, which is really a modded Marshall. You can see by looking at it, it's a modded Marshall. It's like that kind of thing. So I think that probably makes maybe the crowd who have never played a real amp, maybe they haven't played their whole life. Maybe they only started playing and they got a plug-in and they decided, okay, I'll buy a neural plug-in or Tone X or something, and they try a particular amp on there, like, wow, I really like that and it's really cool. I wonder what it would sound like to play through the real thing. And then that's sometimes the starting point. So in a way, like if the digital thing opens up the awareness for modded Marshalls, tube amplifiers, you name it. Like if it opens the eyes of the the consumer to the real deal, like the actual proper analog item, then that's only a great thing. And also there's various companies who also have made Kemper profiles of their amplifiers, and I often wonder if that's probably, again, it's just like a giant advert that also makes money. Because you can give people a taster of what it would be like, but it's a snapshot. It's not how that amp will really respond if you turn the dials. It's a snapshot of that one sound in that moment. And it's like a taster. You're not really getting the whole real thing, but it gives you an idea of, oh, maybe I would like that in real life. So, this is also a great thing. So it probably has increased the awareness.
Cool. Excellent. Jan, did you have any follow-ups that you want on that question, or?
Nah,
So
that was it.
thanks so much, Dan, for that. That's our 10 kind of open questions, and absolutely awesome answers. You give us a lot to be going with there. Really detailed questions, answers. Specifically technically, which was really, really good. Can I mean, just this is my final kind of question, but it's obviously really leading the way I'm going to ask it. But having listened to what you're saying, in a way, what you're offering, and I guess maybe a lot of other modders are offering, is almost like a bespoke amp, right? You're kind of tailoring that amp for the player. I mean, do you think is that true? Is that something you've explicitly, is that part of your philosophy, or what?
In all honesty, that's my number one most important point. And I always try and explain that, because you occasionally get like I get a million emails, right? And it's like some of the emails will come through and you'll have someone who says, "Hey Dan, I really love the sounds of the modded Marshalls by like so and so, this one. Oh, I really like the ones that were used by this artist on that album. Can you replicate that kind of sound for me if I send you this amp?" Those are really easy jobs, because, if you look at it and you know exactly what you need to do for that, then it's like, okay, great. They want that sound. They're not looking for something necessarily that is tailored to them. They've already kind of made their mind up about what it is they want. But when you do those jobs all the time, I don't want to say it gets boring. It doesn't, but it's just, sometimes you'll end up with a run of amps to do, and it's like the same thing, and like you get 6 orders that are identical, and it feels like every day's Groundhog Day. And when you get to work with people who actually contact you, they're like, "Look, here's what I didn't like, these amps. Here's what I did like. What would you recommend?" And they'll say to me, like, "What is it that you would personally think would suit me as a player? And what would you recommend that we do? And can you make something unique for my requirements?" At that point, I love it, because that's such a refreshing thing to do, because you really have to like put your thinking cap on and work out what it is that player is going to like. You got to work with their likes and dislikes and build something that's going to, fit the bill. So for me, those kind of jobs where it's really a little bit more specific, those are the most fun jobs to do. It's just great. It's great fun for me as an amp guy to do that kind of work, and it's also a bit more satisfying, because also, like, pretty much all of those jobs, when someone gets them, like, at least for me so far, there's like never anything other than positive, reviews, in return. And at that point, it's like a little bit of, reassurance in your own mind that, like, yeah, I can do this. I can actually tailor stuff, on a one-to-one basis for guitar players, and like consistently get it right. So yeah, it's a great thing, and that's probably my favorite part of amp modding, actually. So it's cool, actually, that you asked about that.
Brilliant. The other question that we ask, sort of towards the end, you probably talked about this before. Not thinking specifically about the modified Marshalls that have just came out, which you can comment on, but why do you think it took Marshall a bit of while? Do you think they missed the ball, basically, especially back in the 80s? During that period, why did they not bring out anything? Surely they must have been aware of that whole scene and all of these great guitar players that you mentioned using modded Marshalls. Do you think it was? Do you think what's your take on that? Why they didn't respond at that point?
I've got a couple of thoughts about it, and I don't know how true this is, but I heard from someone who was involved quite deeply with Marshall back in the 80s and early 90s, that whenever people would say that question to Jim Marshall, he was very much like, "We're Marshall, we don't need to copy what anyone else is doing." That was kind of his opinion. He was quite a proud guy, and he was like very much like, "You know what? We don't need to just, we don't need to try and do what someone else has already done and made popular. you know, we've had success with the products we've done so far. People love them. We'll continue to do what we do. And I think that was probably true. I would guess, looking at the fact that they never did this back in the 80s and 90s. I mean, they could have done that. They did the Jubilee amps, and they ended up getting Slash on board, you know, at that point, arguably the biggest guitar player of the early 90s, you know, late 80s, early 90s. I mean, you know, they won him over, and they even got him on as a signature artist. So, you know, that was their answer at the time. Like the 2-channel JCM800s that had all the extra controls, you know, and it had like the boost channel in it and stuff, and the Jubilees. I think that was their idea of, okay, this is our take on going higher again than, say, the standard JCM800. And I think they just liked to do it that way back in the day, to make something like, well, you know, this isn't a half-assed thing. This is a brand new thing, and we're proud to put our name on it. And I don't know. I feel a little bit like with the new Marshalls. I like the fact that it's raised some more awareness, because I've had a few people have come to me and asked about those, and then said, "Oh, could you do something like that or even better for me?" So I'm like, okay, great, perfect. You know, send the amp over and I'll do it for you. You know, but at the same time, I kind of hoped that if they were going to do the modded Marshall thing, they would come along and do something that wasn't like putting stickers on a faceplate, you know, and drilling holes in an existing amp and charging another $1,500 for it. I was hoping that they would do a full-blown flagship amp that was a real deal, proper amp, not looking like a modified JCM800, but its own dedicated proper amp, with all the cool stuff in there and everything else. So yeah, that I feel like maybe this modded thing, they jumped on the wagon after they saw lots of mod guys having a lot of success modding brand new Marshalls. But I don't know, for my taste, I feel like they approached it the wrong way. But obviously sales numbers will tell the truth on that one. You know, if they sell like hotcakes, then great. But, you know, if they end up all over the used market, then we'll all know the truth. So it just depends, you know, we'll see what happens. But yeah, I kind of think that maybe if Jim was steering the ship, maybe it would have been done differently, you know. But obviously he's not been around for, you know, a long time now. But at his prime, if he'd been, you know, if it was like his decision back when he was like, you know, like the way he ran it back in the day, it probably would have been done differently, I reckon. So, yeah. But like I say, if it raises awareness for, you know, this sort of stuff, then that's brilliant. It's cool.
You never know. You might be getting some modified Marshalls in to be modified by Dan Gower, and then we'll have Dan Gower modified Marshalls.
Yeah. Exactly. You know, they put the little face, the little flake in the corner with the Marshall modified.
You have to work that about that.
Like I do with these ones where I put like a little plate in the corner, you know, like those.
Yeah.
And there'll be a stack of plates in the corner.
Thanks so much, Dan.
It's a lot of fun. Thanks.